Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining the first of our sessions today on the last day of our annual learning event. And this day we'll be focusing on climate change. And for this session, to open up the day, we have a very exciting lineup of speakers and then a panel conversation all about the evidence for climate smart agriculture for smallholder farmers and the role of digital. And so I think it's going to be a great opening session. If you're tuning in for various other sessions today, we'll have a closing plenary as well this evening, GMT East Africa time, all about climate change too. So without further ado, I would like to just give you the running order. We'll start with Matt Shikoskoy from ISF, the Institute of Smallholder Finance, followed by a pre-recorded video from the World Resources Institute. Then 60 decibels are going to give us some farmer evidence around resilience and impact. And then I'll close the presentations with Agrifin's digital climate smart agriculture strategy for the next 4 years. And then hopefully we'll have time for a panel as well as some public Q&A. So please do send in your questions. So without delaying Matt too much longer, please go ahead and make your presentation. Each presentation will be about 10 minutes, and over to you, Matt.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, John. Great. Well, today, I'm really thrilled to be able to share some of our latest research. And this research is diving into the link between smallholder farmers and climate change. For those of you who follow our work, this is the third of a series of deep dives that build on a 2019 State of the Sector report that we did around smallholder farmer service delivery. And what we wanted to do with this piece is really address the dynamic that there's sort of 500 million smallholder farmers in the world that produce 30 to 34% of the world's food supply. So they're a key constituent in relation to climate change. And yet, when we're looking at sort of the climate crisis, often there's a sense that this constituency and the sort of 2 billion people that rely on smallholder agriculture for their livelihood are relatively unrepresented in the debate. So what we wanted to do with this piece is really go from the top down and frame up how we should think about smallholder farmers in relation to climate change. So in the research, which you can find at the link in the bottom left-hand corner of this particular slide, we really unpack it from the top down. We think about what is the climate challenge for smallholder farmers, how does that relate to a geographic lens, and where will most smallholder farmers be impacted in terms of countries and geographies. Then we step back and really apply what we call a pathways lens, and I can explain that a little bit more as we get into some of the highlights. We think about the emerging response frameworks, and at the end, we offer some recommendations about how to think a little bit differently about this topic. So today, we don't have a lot of time. We're just going to really hit the highlights from this piece of work. And the natural starting point has to be the relationship between agriculture and climate change. On this particular slide, you'll see 4 key numbers. And when you look at the third of those boxes, that 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to food systems, agriculture is absolutely front and center of the climate debate and the climate issue. But looking behind that headline number, we can also see that sort of a third of all land is used for agriculture. Almost 70% of biodiversity losses are due to agriculture. Over 70% of freshwater usage is due to agriculture. Agriculture is key to solving the climate crisis. And yet, we really need to understand a little bit more systematically where smallholder farmers fit into that broader picture. So that's a story that emerges on 2 sides of the ledger. When we look at climate mitigation in relation to smallholders, we can see that while the agricultural sector overall is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The contribution of smallholder farmers is concentrated in really select commodities, so cattle, soy, palm, and rice, and is relatively small overall. So when you compare the greenhouse gas emissions of smallholder farmers to commercial agriculture systems, the emissions barely register. To put it further in context, the average 2-acre smallholder farmer in Kenya produces something like 55 times less carbon than the average American. So when we're thinking about scarce resources, trying to solve a global problem, smallholder farmer greenhouse gas emissions are probably well down the list of big issues to tackle. When we look at the other side of that ledger, though, and think about adaptation, despite their low level of contribution to climate change, smallholder farmers are disproportionately impacted by climate variability and climate-related shocks. The modeling varies and is based on a lot of assumptions, but the World Bank estimates that 143 million smallholder farmers and rural families, climate change will result in land that's no longer arable for them by 2050, forcing them to migrate to other agricultural areas, or to urban areas. So that's a huge number. When we think about that compared to the migration that was triggered by the Syrian civil war, we're talking about a factor of 20 or 30, and that's by 2050. But even for those farmers who choose to remain on their degraded land, they're going to be contending with changing rainfall patterns, increased weeds and pests, more extreme weather events. There is going to be more pressure on their agricultural production. There's been some really good modeling that's out there that helps us systematically consider the potential effect of climate change. And we really like this particular modeling done by Science Advances, which thinks about the vulnerability of small farmers on 3 different dimensions in terms of their potential agricultural productivity impacts, in terms of their dependence on agriculture, and in terms of their adaptive capacity. And the combination of those 3 things really gives a vulnerability profile that, when you look at the data, suggests that in countries that are going to be most hard hit in terms of productivity, they tend to be the countries that also have the highest agricultural dependence and some of the lowest adaptive capacity. And none of that should be a surprise, but we need to start thinking about the smallholder challenge at a country and even a sub-country level when it comes down to particular geographies. So looking at agroecological zones, looking at these dependence and adaptive capacity maps is a really good starting point to start to do that. But what we wanted to do in this piece was also bring a different lens. We've been, I guess, continuing to try to advance the thinking around the different types of segments of smallholder farmers and the way that they can make livelihood choices. So what you'll see on this slide is what we call our livelihood pathways. And we've defined 7 natural starting points for smallholder families and households, and a series of natural livelihood choices that they make in order to earn an income, earn a livelihood. So this particular lens, when you're thinking about vulnerable subsisting farmers as opposed to sort of consolidating commercial farmers and micro small entrepreneurs and rural workers, this is a really valuable lens to sort of think through in terms of the impacts of climate change and the adaptation challenge. So there's much more detail in our deep dive, but here you'll see how we've mapped just the heat map essentially between pathways on the left-hand side of the table, and then the level of relevance in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And the simple message from this slide is that the adaptation challenge is going to be most significant for subsistence farmers and those who are just moving into a commercial and sub-commercial profile of income and livelihood. For the others, on the adaptation side, it's a relatively less significant challenge. Whereas for mitigation, we really should be only focusing on those medium-sized farms and service enterprises that have a carbon blueprint, a footprint that's much more significant. When we applied our minds to thinking about the response, there was, I guess, a natural tendency to go down to the solution level to think about the types of technologies. And I think John will be presenting some really interesting work they've done around their strategy around the solution level. But we decided to think more at, I guess, a climate response framework level. So what are the different frameworks that have emerged to guide the response, the flow of funding, the policy agenda? And we think this is a really interesting way of thinking about the climate response. So here you'll see 6 different types of response frameworks, from landscape approaches to climate smart agriculture, climate financing, food systems approach, technology-led solution approach, and sustainability standards and certification. And what's becoming evident is that there's different sort of lead actors and solution focuses for these different responses. That's important to understand. One thing we're sort of really keen to make sure happens is that we don't build up another set of silos around the flow of funding and the flow of solutions, when at the end of the day, the integration point for a lot of this effort is going to be the smallholder household and how we can build their resilience. So our quick conclusions and recommendations from this thought process. 1, we really need to strengthen the science and research foundations with more localized data-led climate modeling. So there's some really good rolling estimates, rolling modeling that's being done at sort of the national and international level. We need to find a way to have data feeding into those models that gets down to almost the village level, to think very specifically about which villages and areas are going to be most affected by climate change. Secondly, we need to anchor action in government-led but system-based responses. Thirdly, we need to integrate a rural pathways view into all response frameworks so that we don't get that siloing effect of duplicate efforts, duplicate sort of thought processes. This all needs to converge because the challenge is very real and we need all sorts of solutions to come together. Fourth, there really does need to be an increase in funding for innovative adaptation solutions. I think the stats that we came across is that only 1.7% of all climate-related agricultural funding for smallholder agricultural funding is going to adaptation for smallholder farmers. That is in no way enough, and this is going to be a technology-led solution pathway out of the crisis for them. And finally, we need to develop smarter ways of structuring finance. There needs to be ways of crowding in private sector financing and commercial capital, and that requires innovation in the capital markets that's just as important as what we're doing right down at the farm level. So it's a very quick overview. I think I might have run even a minute or two over time, so apologies, John, but back over to you.
Thanks, Matt. And I'll just set up the video now from World Resources Institute. We'll have a chance to have a conversation about some of those very interesting strategies and findings at the end. So just setting this up now.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to quickly thank Mercy Corps for inviting me to this annual learning event and letting me be one of the voices as part of this group of forward thinkers and innovators in this very exciting space. My name is Tyler Ferdinand, and I'm an associate with the Climate Resilience Practice at the World Resources Institute. And during today's session, I wanted to talk to you about one of the initiatives under the Global Commission on Adaptation called the Blueprint for Digital Climate Advisory Services. I also wanted to touch upon what this particular initiative means for a digital agricultural strategy moving forward, and also what else we can be more ambitious about in this field for leveraging digital agriculture for building climate resilience. I just very quickly wanted to set the scene for climate resilience and digital climate-informed advisory services. Current and future climate-induced crop losses are grave. On average, we know that staple crops will be, their yields will be reduced by 3 to 7% for each degree Celsius. Hunger is on the rise. COVID-19 has already pushed an additional 137 million people into hunger, and simultaneously we need to figure out how to increase food production by 25 to 70% by 2050 to make our population's food secure. So where does DCAS come in? DCAS are tools, platforms, or activities that disseminate climate information and help individuals or organizations to make climate resilient decisions and adapt to climate variability and change. These services can be digital services such as mobile apps, radio, or online platforms, but also digitally enabled services such as bulletins and extension services. For those types of agricultural producers who may not be digitally literate or lack access to digital technologies. These services are meant to support rather than replace person-to-person communication and strong agricultural extension services. The DCAS Blueprint is one of the initiatives under the Action Track on Agriculture and Food Security, which is part of the Global Commission on Adaptation, which recently sunset in January of this year. The objective of the Blueprint is to build the resilience of 300 million small-scale producers by 2030. The Blueprint's been co-developed over the past year or so with IRI Colombia, the World Resources Institute, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the World Food Program, and the Global Center on Adaptation, as well as over 250 stakeholders from over 25 different organizations that range from private sector innovators and service providers, funders, and researchers and academics. So what will this blueprint include? I want to emphasize that it's still in the works. This process of building the blueprint was a very intensive, robust, consensus building co-creation exercise, and therefore it's going to be launched in June of this year. But what it includes or will include is a first estimate of the global investment needed by 2030 to scale the access and impact to these types of services. It also has 6 key principles of good practice that were pulled together through a consensus building process with our stakeholders. And these were data quality, equity, financial sustainability, co-creation, accountability and transparency, and scalability. And in the blueprint, we do a little bit of a deeper dive into each of these principles and how they apply to making successful, effective digital climate-informed advisory services. And finally, we generated a preliminary investment typology based on digital readiness and vulnerability. So as you know, the global landscape is a mosaic of different levels of digital readiness in terms of the enabling environments for digital tools as well as digital literacy, in addition to the mosaic of vulnerability to climate impact. So we start to tease apart how different types of services and business models can apply based on this nexus of digital readiness and vulnerability. The question is now, how do we move forward with the evidence that we've gathered from the co-creation of the blueprint to a forward-looking strategy? And what I've been thinking about recently has been what we know and what we don't know. And what we don't know is going to help us to generate next steps. And so we know that DCAS has substantial benefits regarding yields and income, but we still don't have a lot of evidence around how DCAS actually mitigates risks and what are the impacts in terms of built resilience and adaptation through these types of services. So we need to be better at generating that type of evidence to make the business case. We also know that marginal costs are low, but the tracking and reporting on investments, especially in differentiating upfront generation of these services versus annual maintenance costs, is quite poor. And so that will also be critical for informing how we're making the business case for DCAS. We also know that the DCAS ecosystem is diversifying and specializing, but there remains a lot of fragmentation and there remains a lot of redundancy. And so how do we better collaborate and synergize and build off of existing services so that we're not reinventing the wheel? We know that the number of services are rapidly growing, but the engagement versus access gap is rapidly widening. And so less than 50% of registered users are actually active users. And so how do we get beyond that engagement gap? And better yet, how do we get more diversified actors? Because still only about 25% of actors or users in the DCAS space are women. We also know that bundling is the best way to achieve impact, but we're not really clear on what types of bundles are best for building resilience in a sustainable way, especially considering co-benefits of equity and longer term perspectives. And so we need to start playing around with and being innovative about what types of services are we bundling specifically for building climate resilience. And finally, I just wanted to point out that co-creation and MEL are obviously essential for our success, but how do we make these happen in an effective way, given the fact that services are often working with very limited budgets and short project timelines? And so these are some of the types of things that we are thinking about now as WRI with our partners, and wanting to collaborate further on a strategy for how to bridge these knowledge, evidence, and action gaps. Finally, I just wanted to touch upon a couple of synergistic overlapping fields that WRI has been focusing on recently in our forward-looking strategy for raising ambition and taking risks in the climate resilience space. So some of you might have heard about, under the Global Commission on Adaptation, WRI with partners help to develop principles for locally led adaptation. This is relevant for DCAS because of the need for better co-creation, the need for better user engagement, and the need for better access to climate adaptation finance. And we believe that locally led adaptation, one, can help inform better design and application of DCAS, but also DCAS in turn can help with locally led adaptation. Secondly, we have a work stream focusing on transformative adaptation. In terms of transformative adaptation, we're talking about agricultural systems that, due to intensifying climate impacts, will no longer be sustainable in the long term. And so starting to think about how DCAS can not only help farmers in terms of the daily weather forecasts, even seasonal forecasts, but having a more long-term perspective, thinking about transitioning of different types of agricultural systems. So from the last IPCC report, there was an estimate that over 35 million farmers in arid and semi-arid areas in Africa will have to start transitioning from mixed cropping systems to predominantly pastoral livelihoods. And so it's thinking about how DCAS can provide the information to help farmers with those types of transitions. We're also thinking about resilience finance. So we're getting very interested in the innovation of financial tech for building resilience. And this is a new field for us, but we're very excited about it. And finally, for agribusiness management. Currently, WRI is beginning a project on a beta platform for climate risks along agricultural value chains. This will be a global platform, but we'll be focusing on coffee in Colombia, rice paddy, and cotton in India. And what we're thinking about here is not just providing the information that is typically provided from DCAS to farmers and extension agents, but also the types of information platforms that are needed to provide information to those types of agricultural value chain actors that are typically left out of co-creation processes or as part of the audience of these types of services. So we're talking about producer associations, agro-processors, transporters, and the like. And so these are some of the fields that we are currently excited in and see a lot of potential for synergies between DCAS and these areas. And with that, I would like to please encourage you to reach out if you have any questions about the upcoming launch of the blueprint or any of the other types of work that WRI is doing related to this field. And I look forward to collaborating with many of you in the future.
Thank you, Tyler, for that pre-recorded presentation. I think that was an excellent overview of the macro level investment case and need for greater emphasis on these types of solutions. And I think next up is Sonia Kaguru, a senior advisor with 60 Decibels, to talk us through new innovations in farmer impact measurement for resilience. Over to you, Sonia.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks to the entire team at Mercy Corps for inviting 60 Decibels to share our climate resilience approach and work. Now, before I start, I'd just like to give a very quick overview as to who 60 Decibels is. We are a leading impact management firm working around the globe to bring stakeholders closer together. Our business is all about listening. In fact, 60 decibels is actually the measure of the average volume of human conversation. And what we do is we take conversations and turn them into data and insights to propel both the business and social performance of enterprises around the globe that are supporting folks who live below any poverty line. We do this in a way that is leaner and lighter than most of the other players like us. We use mobile technology and a global network of nearly 800 researchers around the globe to quickly and cost effectively collect data for funds, foundations, and impact investors, including Mercy Corps, one of our favorite clients. And we crunch that data in-house to generate insight for the wider industry on what farmers, customers, beneficiaries are saying and what they need. Over the years of doing this work, we've collected data from over 160,000 people across projects with nearly 500 social enterprises in over 55 countries. And as many people have mentioned today, we know that farmers will be impacted first and worst by climate challenges. And over the years of doing this work, we began to hear farmers mentioning, without any prompting in our conversations with them, primarily over the phone, about the burden of climate change in their lives. And it's actually from that data that we started to develop and invest in climate resilience as a major sector for 60 decibels. Now, as we all know, there are many things you can measure if you are interested in impacting in the climate space. You could measure emissions, you could measure companies' internal practices, the energy they use, et cetera. But our sweet spot, as I've mentioned already, is data that is directly coming from the folks at the bottom of the pyramid. And as several folks have mentioned already today, we know that that's a significant evidence gap in the sector. So what we wanted to create was a reasonably short, simple, but somewhat comprehensive set of questions which help us understand and measure how resilient and durable farmers are under actual climate-related shocks and pressures, and what they need to emerge as resilient against or in the midst of those pressures. We believe that data that tells us these things can catalyze action and impact, both from companies, but also from their funders, to move on the interventions, the products, and the services which farmers say they need to be more resilient. So very quickly on how we started this work, we did a lot of research. We talked to a lot of experts and worked with a lot of the data that we had from our agriculture work in-house to identify the key practices that resilient farmers do and the things that resilient farmers have that other farmers don't do or do not have. And we whittled that list down to the most important, most essential, most ubiquitous aspects or priorities. And we use that list to socialize with climate experts, primarily at the CGIAR. And then we developed our climate resilience tool. Now, our approach is based on 3 principles, which we know are the foundation for understanding how resilient a farmer is. Each of these principles is a module with a set of questions and calculations which is unique to it. The first module is the routines module. It is, in short, the things a farmer does. It is the farmer's awareness and the farmer's adoption of sustainable farming practices, both for their own resilience, but also to encourage a cleaner, more sustainable emission sink environment. We have a focus in this module on water and land management practices, on soil health, on crop mix, and other behaviors which support the farmer's long-term ability to be more resilient. The second principle is resources. It is the things that farmers have. It is farmers' access to agricultural inputs, to services, to farmers' access to advice and insurance and markets, especially that could help them mitigate the effects of climate change on their farm. And I'll say myself, being a small-time farmer, that these are things that you would expect a farmer to have, like market, that they will not always have, even a more sophisticated or wealthy farmer. Now, the third principle is recovery. It is the farmer's ability to respond to a shock. I think one of the most salient things we learned in our years of research is one of the most important things to climate resilience is money. It is financial freedom and the farmer's ability to respond monetarily to a climate shock. That is why likely everybody on this call is climate resilient, and most of the farmers that we serve or work with are not. Now, one thing that you will notice about our principle and what we're measuring is that we believe that resilience is both the resilience of the farmer's actual livelihood, but it is also sustainable, climate smart farming. We believe that understanding the true resilience of a farmer is both of those things. And that's what we're really trying to collect and measure in our tool. Now, each of these themes, and I'm using resources here as an example, is based on a set of metrics. And each metric, as you can see in the second column, in the first column here, is associated with a question. How each farmer responds to or answers the question that we pose to them is how they will be scored. And we score from 0 to 3, 0 being very risky and 3 being very resilient. The scores are allocated both to the metric itself, to the wider theme, so in this case, resources, and then also a final resilience score is generated both for the farmer themselves, but also the wider group of farmers. We then use that score to give the company a clear picture of how resilient their farmers are, but most importantly, what they can do to make their farmers more resilient. Now, this is an example anonymized slide from a recent climate project that we did. This is a living, breathing document. This is a tool that we are actively iterating on, and we've tested it and piloted it with about 1,200 farmers across Africa, both East and West. And to give you just a sneak peek of what clients get, you can see here that these farmers, this example group of farmers, are emerging in their access to resources, the resources that are, again, critical to climate resilience. So while they have very good access to improved farm asset being seed, and they have very good access to market, they have very poor access to a credit line, and they have also quite poor access to a good water source. Now, based on the data from this theme of resources, as well as the other two themes being routines and recovery, we are also sharing just a very quick look at the sort of insights and recommendations we're generating for enterprises and funders. Again, this is work that we are continually working to iterate on, and we are also trying to build the database, which we will utilize to provide wider insights to the industry. But we have a few things that we are already learning around farmer climate resilience. I think the first thing that I'll mention, and I'm nearly sure I'm out of time, is around crop insurance, which is something that folks are mentioning in the sector as something that is really important for farmers. We know that Western farmers, through government crop insurance, otherwise known as subsidies, are held steady and are resilient because of their access to that service. And it's something that African farmers, Asian farmers do not have good access to. But we were hoping to see a small number of farmers, especially in the wealthier farmers that we spoke to, having some level, even in the livestock space, of access to crop insurance. and it's not something we're seeing at all. So there are pockets where we are seeing some of our assumptions affirmed, and then other areas where we're really quite shocked. For instance, we are seeing very low water conservation and management practices, things you would expect to see like drip irrigation or use of trenches. Very few farmers seem to be practicing some of those conservation methods, even like harvesting rainwater. We see very rarely. So we're slowly trying to build this data in order to ensure that we can generate those insights and action for these companies, investors, but also for the sector.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. I think it was fine for you to go over a bit because I'm continuously blown away by the insights that 60 decibels is generating, and very glad to see your renewed focus on climate change issues. If we don't have the measurements in place to understand if these digital solutions are impactful, then we're all flying blind, right? So I'm just going to quickly present the Agrifin strategy about climate change, because this is all about evidence to action, and why we need to act now to start putting these solutions in place. I'm going to try and take as short a time as possible, because this is not just about Agrifin, but also the digital sector in general. But why are we now focusing on digital climate smart agriculture? Well, over the last 6 years, Mercy Corps Agrifin has implemented a program largely focused on digital service provision for smallholder farmers through over 150 partners and reaching 5 million smallholder farmers. A lot of focus on digital financial services, digital information services, etc. But during that time, we've witnessed the impacts of climate change firsthand. Multiple droughts, pests, including pests and diseases, including fall armyworm and desert locust outbreaks, and major issues that are disrupting the value chain for smallholder farmers and impacting the businesses that are serving them digitally. So we're now reaching the next phase of our program, another 4 years, thanks to a number of donors, many of whom will be attending today. And we are going to focus primarily on how do we now adapt these digital solutions for gender inclusiveness and digital climate smart agriculture. A quick reminder about what climate smart agriculture is. It's really, as a phrase, only been around for about 10 years. And digital climate smart agriculture only about 3 years when CEAT first coined the phrase. What does it really mean? Well, climate smart agriculture is about managing trade-offs. It's about capitalizing on synergies between productivity, adaptation, and mitigation. It's not any one of those. And it's not really just a set of practices and technologies, but an approach. It has to be flexible across contexts to be relevant to different farmers in different locations all over the world. And all of these pillars should be interacting with each other. There is a consensus around what technologies are really impactful for small-scale farmers, and CEAT and the World Bank and FAO have done a lot of work in this area. So if you're seeking guidance on what sort of solutions have the most impact, then a lot of it really focuses around conservation agriculture, intercropping, organic inputs, water and crop tolerance to stress. But why digitize? Why is it? Why is digital relevant for the climate smart agriculture challenge? We often get this question at Agrifin. Well, we've seen that digital learning can reach more people faster and at lower cost. We need to help farmers change behaviors and adapt to new ways of farming quickly, at scale, and in a way that is effective for them. And we found that digital learning can do that. As I think Sonia and many others have referred to in their presentations, digital finance and insurance services are a big barrier, but also a big suite of solutions. Farmers need to be financed to be able to make the changes that they will need to make to adapt to climate change. As many of you will know, digital lends itself to customization. It's pretty easy to adapt solutions constantly in real time to share information that may be relevant for farmers, but also adapt to new contexts. Digital platforms, I think we had a great session on digital platforms yesterday, but digital platforms can provide opportunities for multiple providers and specialists to provide services. For example, Pula has been doing great work in the crop insurance space, and they are often partnering with digital platforms like DigiFarm and others who reach large numbers of farmers. And digital is a rapidly developing field. Data is going to be more and more important to understand what's going on for everyone. I just quickly want to take you through some learnings that we've learned over the years. Climate, as you all know, is more volatile in smallholder farmer context, but a lot of our partners are trying to understand and mitigate that risk, but often don't know how. The quality of new technology is often unknown, so the science in many cases is either not there yet or not proven, and many new technologies are out there, but mostly in the commercial agriculture space and not for smallholder farmers. Digital information services and learning is often more developed than digital finance. Public sector institutions are essential. There is a big investment gap, and I think all of our speakers have really spoken to that. Digital climate smart agriculture, in our experience, really requires quite complex pilots to test out the solutions that may be game changers for smallholder farmers, like precision agriculture services. You need a very complex set of data points, a good team behind you, and a lot of investment. Farmers are asking for new and improved markets for climate smart crop adoption. If they are going to take on new crops, new systems, they need the market. And partners are really interested in these new solutions, but don't know how to access them. Digital climate smart agriculture offers opportunities across the value chain, and it is not just one area of interest. Now, this is an important slide. I think it's still a draft that we've been putting together, but essentially it shows that the digital climate smart agriculture solution market is really underdeveloped. There are a number of solutions that are emerging and some that are maturing, but perhaps not adopted at scale. Some of the solutions you'll see here are blended solutions. Conservation agriculture learning can be digitized, but it also requires field force. And so I think we are at the very nascent early stages of a movement towards digital climate smart agriculture services that rapidly needs to be scaled up, which leads to why Agrifin is working in this space. We have been working on a model of design, test, and scale via partnerships for many years, but now we want to focus on digital climate smart agriculture because new partnerships are required between public and private actors. Emerging climate smart agriculture solutions, as we've just seen in the previous slide, require piloting and de-risking for partners to really have the confidence to scale them up to farmers quickly. Farmers want bundling of solutions. I think Tyler spoke to this very effectively, but I think we haven't really even cracked the ground yet on how we bundle climate smart agriculture services, and that is a huge area and opportunity area, but somewhere where we need to double down our investments. And our model generally is about agile innovation, brokering scale partnerships, and learning with lean data and agile monitoring and evaluation approaches, which will be key as we take this on. Now, I'm going to wrap up very quickly in about a minute or so, but I just want to take you on, I just want to present our objectives for the next few years. And that's really to help smallholder farmers adapt to climate change through sustainable intensification, access to finance and data intelligence, emergency response and early warning systems. We've seen the power of citizen reporting tools through WhatsApp and other systems, also weather information systems recently to help protect farmers ahead of climate-related emergencies. And I think we still want to play in the area of climate technology innovation for mitigation. There are emerging carbon credit markets and systems that could be very relevant for smallholder farmers, and we look to test that out. Now I'm going to flick through a few slides here. We have a number of design principles that we're happy to share with the sector on how to design digital services for climate smart agriculture. And I just want to end on this slide, recognizing the need to pilot test and really de-risk a lot of these solutions. We're going to look at ring fencing a facility with our partners to design, test, and learn emerging digital climate smart agriculture solutions, many of which are not scale ready for smallholder farmers, but need to be proven before we really try and scale them up. I think a good example might be soil carbon measurement and carbon credit markets, Another example might be much more tailored precision agriculture services that recommend certain crops and inputs. These need to be tested and we need to learn from them. And we're going to be sharing with you all of those learnings as we embark on this journey over the next 4 years. So I've rushed through that because it's a lot of content, but I would like to now turn over to our panel so that we have at least 15 minutes of a conversation and to take some audience questions as well. So I'll just ask that Sonia, Matt, and Christina turn on their cameras. Cristina Rombitis del Rio is from the World Resources Institute. She's the senior advisor for climate adaptation and resilience there, and will be able to take questions broadly, but also specifically for on Tyler's presentation. Sonia and Matt, you've all heard from already. So I'll just open up a quick question before going to questions from the audience. I think, Sonia, you touched on this already quite a bit, but I'm interested in more information about what farmers are saying they need to really adapt to climate change, and especially, you know, what you're seeing on the digital landscape and what kind of digital services farmers are specifically requesting.
Thanks so much, John. So as I mentioned already, I think 2 areas that we have been focusing on lately is around crop insurance and then water source, as well as water conservation strategies. But I think the one area that farmers are having poor access, but also have high interest and prioritize this as of importance on their farm is around training. So we recently did a study with 400 farmers here in Kenya, and we asked them, of all of the things that you want more of on your farm, what would you want most of? And training on farming practices was actually first. Now, this surprised us because this particular group of Kenyan farmers, we believed them to be more modern. We believed them to have better access to farming things. They lived in a good farming ecosystem, but they do not have good access to agronomists and to vets. And if they don't have good access to agronomists and vets, then I really do not know who has. I actually am also among those Kenyan farmers, and I have on my piggery very poor access to veterinary services. And we do know from the wonderful work that Agra does that I think on the African continent, there is 1 agronomist for every 100,000 farmers, which is shocking. So that's an important place that I just want to call out, because it's also a place where there is potential for digital services. Now, I'm not the person who believes that technology will save us. I don't think technology is going to test your soil. I think there are limitations, but I think that the digital arena could play a significant area in helping farmers with the information and the support that they need to improve their farming practices. So I think that's one key area. Now, the other place that we saw farmers asking for more was in access to key inputs, primarily feeds and fertilizers, and again, better water supply. Even farmers in water-rich areas, farmers in areas which will sometimes experience flooding, wanted more reliable supply, more stable everyday supply to water. So those are the things that we're seeing. I think that, to your point, and also I think it was Tyler, around bundled services. I think that what we encourage a lot of enterprises to do is to include a digital aspect to their everyday service. So whether that's SMS, text messages to farmers to say, we actually don't expect the rains to start, but 3 weeks from when you expect them, so plant a little bit later. That kind of information really goes a long way, because a lot of these companies have legitimacy and trust with farmers, but they also have direct access to farmers. We don't know where all farmers are receiving, their information on farming and where they're receiving information generally. And so we do know that using these companies and these close relationships to direct information to farmers, it has a high potential for impact.
Great, thank you so much, Sonia, and some really important points there. I'm always blown away by that stat, Matt, you shared that less than 1.7% of climate finance is going to smallholder farmers currently. And I think I'm going to bundle a few questions here together. One of them on bundling itself from Lisa. She says, we need to rethink digital product bundling and partnerships. What products and related partnerships are most important to get into bundles? And I would also just add to that Sonia's question, Mariam's question from Busara about WRA's perspective on resilient finance for DCAS and how tech integrated financing options can be more accessible for farmers. So those two kind of go hand in hand, and perhaps Christina, you could start and then Matt chime in with what you're seeing on the big needs in that landscape.
Thanks, John. And just to say, it's a real pleasure to be here along with Sonia and Matt on this panel. I think there's a lot of things that are needed. I can put it into kind of 4 categories, all beginning with I, conveniently enough. I mean, without a doubt, investment. We need much more investment in this space and in smallholder resilience. And this will need to be, this is in the billions, to be clear. It needs to be both public and private. There are real returns on investment. And for instance, as part of the blueprint, we looked at the potential returns on investment for digital climate advisory services. And it's strongly positive and in the range of 7 to 10 for service providers, but also for farmers, clearly through improved production, improved prices, reduced input or more efficient input use. So we need that investment from both the public sector and the private sector. And I'd say we also need to de-silo the funding that is there. I mean, there are climate funds that are there. There's humanitarian assistance funding, there's disaster risk reduction funding, there's development funding, all in different little silos that could be used more fluidly to do the sorts of work that needs to be done to build the resilience of smallholder farmers, so that we have less of a need for humanitarian response and fewer crises. The second category is an investment in that infrastructure. And I don't just mean the infrastructure to really improve access to markets and along the value chain and reducing food loss and waste, but it's also the infrastructure for access to information. So how do we get the mobile systems and the digital systems developed to be able to provide advisory services, so that it is not just that one agronomist being able to do what he or she can do directly, but through digital means to really scale up that access. And also the infrastructure for the governance, right? There's very important governance issues here around data, around privacy, around accountability that we need to be developing and investing in now. The third category, I would say, is that intermediation, that bringing together of solution providers, those with need, those with information that's relevant. And this is why I'm such a huge fan of Agrifin, because this is so much of what you do is bring together the different parts of the ecosystem to develop and design solutions that work. And so there's definitely a need to scale that up. There's also a need for these global public goods, for lack of a better term, that really benefit everyone. So the core models that are used to develop some of the projections that we're talking about, like what Matt has shown, or the crop models and the validation of those models, instead of every different service provider doing that on their own and parameterizing and improving those models, couldn't we have a global effort to do that together and to do that in a robust way that benefits everyone and everyone who needs that information? So a real need for shared services and shared information. And then last but not least, and we've talked about this already, there's still a need for innovation and learning. I've been in this field for 15 years, and I feel like we're still really grappling with some fundamental questions, which Sonia, your research is so profound, because it is grappling with the fundamental questions of what is it that farmers need and what is truly going to build their their resilience, you know, and I think we're still trying to understand what that is in different contexts and how to deliver it most effectively, equitably, and efficiently. And you know, there's definitely a tech side to this to understand the bundling questions that Lisa raised, to develop the you know, heat tolerant varieties that we're going to need to tolerate warmer temperatures. But it also needs to be farmer-led innovation, and we also need that farmer perspective. I know my colleague Tyler mentioned the principles for locally led adaptation, and we're very pleased that Mercy Corps was one of the very first wave of endorsers of those principles. But it articulates that you really need that local leadership and involvement to develop effective solutions, because climate change adaptation at the end of the day is hyper local. It really does depend on those local contexts and that capacity to adapt and change. So I think we need to be kind of changing the paradigm where it's not just research in labs that's gonna make everyone more resilient, particularly smallholders. It's really going to be an ecosystem approach driven from below. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Christina. And over to you, Matt, really to help us sum up as well. Where do you see the greatest needs being to unlock this action over the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, this all comes against the backdrop of almost 50 years of a challenge that is centered around how do you profitably and at scale serve smallholder farmers. And that's been a challenge that we've, as a development sector and as the private sector and as the public sector, all struggled with for a long time. So putting the climate lens across all of this certainly adds a new dimension, but the fundamental challenge of how do you reach smallholder farmers with appropriately designed services? How do multiple actors come together in order to combine their capabilities to make that cost effective? And how do you stream together capital of different sources? Because inevitably there's going to be a subsidy element to a lot of this. That doesn't go away. And I think the climate challenge adds a new lens, a new dimension. But I think my big message is we need innovation, not just at the product level, which needs to be farmer-led and farmer-informed, which is what Christina's rightly saying, but it needs to be at the partnership level, as Lisa is sort of indicating, and it also needs to be at the capital market level. And this sort of combination of innovation that's needed at all levels, I think needs to be integrated. Well, there's a really amazing opportunity to integrate that around the climate imperative, which I think is going to bring people together in a whole new way.
Wonderful, Matt. Thank you so much. I don't think I could have summarized it better myself, so I won't try. But thank you, Christina, Sonia, and Matt, and Tyler as well, for some excellent presentations about taking the evidence and creating action around digital climate smart agriculture solutions. I'd just like to remind everyone these sessions are being recorded. You can see some of the resources in the agenda of the Feedloop platform. And the next session, immediately after this session now, is about the open content for agriculture platform, which I'm sure will also touch on some of those climate smart agriculture content needs as well, and the need for global public goods. So just to, again, thank you so much to all of the panelists and questions, and let's hope we can all work together for this climate challenge. Goodbye.